Welcome.
Max. Welcome.
Welcome, Phil.
Thank you. Well, thank you for the kind introduction, the limited amount of German that I understood. It was complimentary. So this will be a lecture on some of the themes picked up in the book. I will say that the book is a little bit more abstract and less focused on current affairs. There is some chapters in there about the war in Ukraine and the transition into the post-liberal world. But the current lecture, I think, will try to take a more current affairs focus on what's actually going on right now, because what is going on right now are some of the biggest global changes that we've seen, not really since the Second World War, but I'd say since the First World War. In fact, you could read what's currently happening as the collapse of the long 20th century, in a sense, and a return to a pre-1914 world. So the first question, of course, is what is liberalism? And there's been a debate about this now for a number of years after Patrick Deneen launched his book, The American Political Scientist, Why Liberalism Failed. And since then, there's been attempts to define liberalism, and there's been a variety of interpretations of it. I think they're all moving in the same direction, but my basic idea is that liberalism is a sort of a total theory of history, even if its proponents don't fully understand that. And what it aims to do is create homogeneity in the population, render people completely equivalent, render ideas completely equivalent, effectively complete relativism. That's what liberalism aims at. And it's always aimed at that in some sense historically. It's just not had the opportunity to put that in place. Unlike Marxism, which is effectively liberalism's cousin on my reading. Yes.
Probably that every individual is a unit and they're all equal and there's no structures in society, like we're all atoms in a homogenized society.
Yes, that's the idea. And then in contrast to the Marxist idea, where even the economy becomes homogenized, in liberalism, there is then allowed competition between the atoms, as you say, and whatever kind of emerges out of this competition of homogeneous atoms is an optimal structure. We call it Pareto equilibrium in economics. But even before they had a notion of Pareto equilibrium, this was the conception.
So liberalism doesn't take into account social structures or wants to do away with them. So it's not like structures are something that are natural to any society. Could one say that?
I think liberalism would view social structures based on what they would see as arbitrary hierarchies as hostile to enlightened modernity. I'm basically saying what Karl Marx and Friedrich Engels said in the Communist Manifesto: all that is solid melts to air, all that is holy is profaned. That is really, they had a very accurate description, but whereas Marx and Engels thought they were talking about capitalism, they were really talking about liberalism. Yes. and the structures of liberal capitalism.
Yes.
So that's my basic kind of thesis on what liberalism is. But where did it come from? I mean, it is definitely an ideas-based doctrine. And in the book, I talk about the history going back to the English Civil War and John Locke's two treatises on government, the English Civil War being the first major liberal event. It wasn't a civil war, it was a revolution. It's only called a civil war because the English wanted to pretend that they had constitutional continuity when they didn't. But you can actually trace the tendencies in liberalism, and the tendencies especially historically in what you might call global liberalism, back further to the development of the British naval forces it starts around the time of Edward the Confessor in the 11th century, but really it gets most of its energy during Henry VIII's reign. And effectively, this was a form of privateering where the king didn't want to develop his own navy, so he handed out what would later become letters of marque to various entrepreneurs who were just pirates, really, and they were allowed, in certain terms, attack non-English vessels, the countries that they were at war with, and they were allowed to keep the loot, the treasure chest of the pirate. And there was a lot of, I think this is the beginning of a certain liberal tendency, because there's an element of rule breaking and lawlessness to the whole thing. It's not actually a formal army. It's something else. It's a marrying of global foreign policy, we'd call it, with commercial policy, very explicitly so. The English privateers were not really what people today sometimes think. So actually, it's funny, we don't talk about this period in British history very much, and we don't talk about this period in European history anymore either. The early modern period, which I think is the most important period in Western history, has become unfashionable. And I think that's partly because there are some secrets hidden in the early modern period that people don't really want to talk about. So if you just take the example of Sir Walter Raleigh, today he's generally remembered for the English colonization of North America and the defense of England against the Spanish Armada. So to the extent that we know Sir Walter Raleigh, he's a hero. But of course, Raleigh was effectively a privateer. So he was a sort of a pirate, and he was implicated in the main plot, as it was called, to remove King James I from the throne and replace King James with Lady Arabella Stuart. Now, we don't have to get into the history of the Stuart monarchy, but that's a pretty controversial thing to do. And it's kind of strange. You see this time and again in English history especially, that you'll have these figures that you're not really sure if they're good guys and bad guys, or bad guys, you know. Cromwell today, for example, who really is the first liberal politician, has a very mixed legacy in Britain, not just among the Irish because of the atrocities caused in Ireland, but even there. So some people say he's a great representative of the parliamentary side, and other people think he's a regicide, that he's a king killer and a bit of an anarchist, and led kind of a mob actually against the king. So this whole period is very unusual, but it soon spread out of Britain. America, very shortly after the establishment, this is a document from April the 3rd, 1776, of course, the year of the Revolution. John Hancock, the famous John Hancock for his signature, signed a letter of marque for the Americans. So what happened was the states realized that unless they engaged in this activity, they would lose. It was a sort of an arms race of privateering. You couldn't stay out of it, really.
So liberalism is really piracy?
I think the way that liberalism spread around the globe was piracy. Yeah. I mean, effectively, that's how the current marrying of commercial and foreign policy, which is what we saw at the peak of the global liberal empire, if you want to put it that way, clearly emerges from this period. And goes all the way into the British Empire and so on. The question then is, if liberalism is this homogenizing, slightly lawless entity that tries to tear apart social structures and create commercial relationships wherever it goes, what is liberalism's opposite? Well, it's the basic structure of Western society, although you can apply this to non-Western cultures too, that recognizes that there are natural hierarchies in society, based usually on some sort of natural law principles. This isn't to say all hierarchies are good. Of course, if you read Plato's Republic, you'll see that there are forms of hierarchy like tyranny and oligarchy, which are not good. But there are also forms of hierarchy that are good. And the more that your society conforms to those hierarchies, the better ordered your society will be. And that's effectively the pre-liberal, and I would say it will be the post-liberal viewpoint. Most people don't realize this, but half of John Locke's treatise on government, remember there are two treatises on government. Now, the second treatise on government is what we all remember Locke for, contract theory, entering into a contract with the state, all the basic liberal governance structures. But the first book is an extended refutation of Sir Robert Filmer, who was a Protestant, a defender of the natural right of kings. So it wasn't a standard Catholic defense. It was a slightly inventive defense come up with by an English Protestant trying to defend the Church of England and the British Crown. It's an unusual book. It's called Patriarcha, or The Natural Powers of Kings. It's rarely read anymore. But it's an interesting book in many ways, and basically it's reasoning based on analogy. He says that the king has the same rights and duties to his subjects as the father has to his children. So he does use a lot of Old Testament analogies and so on, but really it boils down to this idea that there's a natural hierarchy in society that better orders the society. And Locke spends an entire book of his 2 treatises trying to demolish this. So what I'm saying about liberalism isn't speculative if you actually read back into the history of it. So what is it? I mean, ultimately, liberalism is born out of a hatred of hierarchy and monarchy. Liberalism was an anti-monarchical doctrine, first and foremost. Locke publishes his 2 treatises on government anonymously because there's already been the Republic has fallen, the Restoration has taken place, and he knows that his book will be read as an attack on the monarchical structure. So he publishes it anonymously and publishes his epistemological work under his own name. He didn't want the 2 things to be associated with one another. I don't think the early liberals realized what train they were setting in motion. I think Robert Filmer would not be surprised that liberalism ultimately becomes questioning of gender hierarchies, transgenderism, this kind of thing. I think Filmer would say, well, that's what you'd expect. If you start by attacking natural hierarchies, you'll attack all the way down. I think Locke and some of the early liberals will be shocked at that development, but I think that's just because they didn't understand their own doctrine. I think the likes of Sir Robert Filmer understood the doctrine much better than they did. So this brings us, that's a very brief introduction. The book goes into much more detail, but now we'll start to focus on what's actually going on in the world today, because my claim in the book is that this entire system and ideology is in free fall. It's collapsing by the day, effectively. We'll start with China. China's been the main driving force, I would say, behind the collapse of global liberalism. And I think Westerners just do not understand what's happening in China. And part of that is due to a miscommunication, and part of it is due to active propaganda against the country. So the narrative that a lot of people get is that after Chairman Mao died, Deng Xiaoping took over the country. He was purged by Mao, and he brought in reforms. The opening up period in China, which brought with it a form of market capitalism, or at least managed market capitalism, and that led to the China that we see today. And there is a lot of truth to that. But what was assumed for a very long time, especially in the 90s, was that this would ultimately produce liberalism. And people are now realizing that it's not producing liberalism, and it's scaring liberals quite a lot. It should have been obvious. I mean, if you actually followed the debates in China, it would have been obvious to anybody that what they were pursuing was not just non-liberal, it was non-Western. Their concepts of what they wanted to do with their society, they call it a Zhaokang society, which means moderately prosperous society in Chinese. This is a Confucian ideal. It somewhat maps onto our idea of creating a middle-class society. It has similarities, but it's a distinct concept from a civilization that's 5,000 years old. So it was very hubristic of liberal thinkers like Francis Fukuyama to think that this would all just collapse into Western liberalism. So even when they began the reform and opening up period, the language that they were using was not Western political theory. And that should have highlighted people, but the liberals tended to be quite narcissistic, and they'd read everything in terms of their own liberalism. Again, this is going back to the 80s. I think this paper's from 1981. One of the major threats that they saw in the 80s in the reform and opening up period to Zhaokang, this moderately prosperous society, was Zhichan JJ Zihao. I can't pronounce it properly, but it basically means bourgeois liberalization. This is Marxist terminology somewhat, but what they're talking about isn't really anything to do with Marxism or anything else. This is a classic instance where terminology from a foreign ideology is being used to defend a civilizational culture. And what they're actually threatened by is is the kind of very liberal cultural tendencies that come in when aspects of liberal capitalism come in. So this is a newspaper from 1984, the National Times, and it says that China blames the West for what it called cultural pollution. This is during the height of the Deng reform period, and the story behind this is actually very interesting and telling. Deng Xiaoping in 1981 saw a film called Unrequited Love, and in the screenplay, there's a scene where, after years of humiliation and anguish, a painter has a chance to leave China, and he says to his daughter, "But I love my motherland." And the daughter replies, "Sure, but does your country love you?" I mean, we'd think that this is a very anodyne scene in a film, but Deng stated, "I'm told that the artistic level of the film is quite high. That makes it all the more poisonous. Just think of the effect the film would have if it were shown publicly." And so the campaign was born out of this, and it targeted obscene, barbarous, or reactionary materials, vulgar taste in artistic performances, and indulgence in individualism. So it's very clear that what was being attacked here wasn't even so much criticisms of the Communist Party or criticisms of the Chinese state. It was what they saw as vulgarity and decadence built into the culture. So this brings us to the large BRICS meeting that took place in 2024 in Kazan last October. And you'll see all the leaders of the BRICS here. The most prominent, obviously, are Xi Jinping, Vladimir Putin, and probably Narendra Modi. But what stands out is that most of these people are not liberals at all. In fact, they're anti-liberal. Maybe the closest thing you'd get to liberalism in the BRICS bloc is Brazil, arguably, although that might change, and potentially South Africa, but South Africa is an unusual state in itself. Apart from that, these are not liberal powers or liberal countries. So this brings us to what has driven these changes. Part of it is ideological, as I've alluded to, but part of it is economic. I'm not a Marxist, but I think that economic determinism has some truth to it, a limited truth. And so the core of the multipolarity story, or the collapse of global liberalism story, is the rise of China. In 2017, on a constant purchasing power parity basis, which is the correct way of measuring GDP. Anybody who says that there are alternative measures, it's propaganda. In 2017, China became the largest economy in the world. And since then, it's about 20 to 25 to 30% larger than the American economy. That's just a fact. China is the largest economy in the world and has been for nearly a decade. And we're sort of pretending that it's not. But even beyond this, if you take all the Western countries together, I've called them the Western grouping here in the grey line, and this is Europe, North America, Canada, Australia, Japan, South Korea, we kind of include them in the Western bloc. If we take them and we compare them to the BRICS countries, and this chart is a little bit old because since I did this study, the BRICS have actually added what I've called their shortlist here into the bloc. So the yellow line there is effectively today's BRICS. And what we see is around the same time as China became the largest economy in the world, around 2016, the BRICS outpaced the entire Western bloc in terms of how large an economy it was.
Is the Western bloc OECD or?
Roughly. I mean, I'm adding in Japan, South Korea, anyone we consider a kind of an ally. I always think of the Western bloc, if you ever we'll see it shortly, the sanctions, which countries sanctioned Russia. That's effectively the Western bloc. But the point is that the BRICS bloc has been larger than the Western bloc for about a decade now. And we kind of missed this development. And I think now that people are waking up to it, they're getting a bit terrified. And that's just on an absolute basis. But if we think about the rate of change, growth, because ultimately capitalism is interested in growth. If I'm starting a company or I want to focus my development on a region, I don't look necessarily for the largest economy. I look at the fastest growing economy because it has the most opportunities. And what we see is that in terms of contributions to Western GDP, the BRICS have been the major contributor for a very long time, probably for most of the 2000s. But since 2008, we've seen a significant slowdown in the growth of the Western grouping countries, to the extent that they now don't actually make up a great deal of global growth. And the BRICS are making up more than half of total global growth right now. So the BRICS economies are the most dynamic in the world. And increasingly, we see that technologically coming out of China. In terms of global trade, the Western bloc still has a little bit of a lead. Now, China is, as of 2020, the largest global trade partner in the world. It's larger now than the European Union, which used to be, and it's certainly larger than the United States. But if we add the entire Western bloc together, we see that the Western grouping is still slightly larger in terms of trade than the BRICS grouping. This will change, and as we see, it's changed dramatically. In 2000, the BRICS made up maybe 11% of global trade, and the Western bloc made up about 37%. And now, it's pretty close to even. So those are the long-term drivers, and so the multipolarity or the collapse of global liberalism, which are effectively the same thing, same phenomenon, was inevitably going to happen due to these changes. But in the past few years, we've seen a dramatic acceleration of these changes, and the trigger was the war in Ukraine. I always think it's good to look back on the start of the war. I'll admit myself, I didn't believe that Russia was going to invade Ukraine. I saw the military buildup. I think the smarter people tended not to think they'd do it. And the reason I didn't think they'd invade, and I think this is the reason that a lot of people thought, was because I thought it would just be too disruptive to the Russian economy. And what I realized afterwards, and I think everybody realized afterwards, that the global economy had changed completely. And the Russians had understood that, and the Chinese had understood it, and we didn't. And so it's good to look at the run-up to that war just to understand what was going on. This is a headline from the 4th of February. The invasion's on the 22nd, if I remember correctly. And China joins Russia in opposing NATO expansion. This was a big hint. I think when people were paying a lot of attention to the military minutiae, we really should have been paying attention to what was happening in global diplomacy. But we largely ignored this. Then after the invasion, China clarified its neutral stance on Russia. This was within about a week. I don't know about other people, but within about a week, I had begun to figure out what was going on, that I'd realized that the Chinese and the Russians had some sort of a plan to maintain the economy and so on, that this wasn't some freak out or a rational move by the Putin government. And since then, the West has become increasingly isolated since the beginning of the war, and paranoid in a lot of ways. This is the sanctions chart that I mentioned earlier. The countries in yellow are the countries that imposed sanctions. I don't know why Japan's not marked. Japan did impose sanctions, but even if you mark Japan, you can just see it's a fairly small geographic region that's imposing the sanctions on Russia. And of course, we've already seen that the rest of this, that's, not all of it, all of these grey countries are BRICS, but the bigger ones they're continuing the trade. And so this explains why the Russian economy hasn't just not collapsed. It's actually been doing quite well since the beginning of the war. And the United States went all in on the Russian sanctions. This is a tweet that really has to go down in history by President Biden. It's almost, you could give a lecture on this tweet itself. It says, as a result of our unprecedented sanctions, the ruble was almost immediately reduced to rubble. The Russian economy is on track to be cut in half. It was ranked the 11th biggest economy in the world before the invasion. Soon it will not even rank among the top 20. I mean, a few things about this. First of all, the Russian economy is not the 11th. This is based on nominal GDP. I don't know if the Americans put out this tweet as propaganda, or if they really didn't understand how to read, GDP, constant GDP per capita purchasing power. But it was not the 11th. And the other thing that stands out is he claims that the Russian economy will be cut in half. It is incredibly hard to half the GDP of a country. I mean, you might have seen that in Zimbabwe after the land seizures. But even in the case of Iran, which was subject to sanctions, I don't think their GDP fell by half. So these were pretty extreme claims anyway. But of course, now I'll say from my own perspective, when I saw this, I immediately knew, because I'd modeled the ruble in my previous job as an investment analyst, and I knew that the ruble was basically an energy currency and that it would track the oil price. And of course, that's what happened. This is only a few months after the war, so the war starts in February 22. This is from June 21, so this is only a few weeks after the war. The Russian ruble keeps rising, hitting a 7-year high. It went up, it came down with the oil price and so on, but nothing really happened with the ruble. And
June 22, right?
June 22. So what's so striking about this is that President Biden put out this tweet promising a collapse of the ruble, and in real time, everybody watched the exact opposite happen. Russia is now growing while Europe sinks. This is, again, going back a little bit, this is in January 2024. So people had largely digested the lack of effectiveness of the foreign exchange sanctions and so on. But by January 2024, the IMF was telling us that Russia was growing and that Europe was shrinking, or at least was stagnant. The other aspect that's really interesting from the sanctions is the reserve seizure, the taking of the Russian foreign exchange reserves. Now, anyone who understood how foreign exchange reserve markets and asset markets worked would have been able to say that this would probably reduce the strength of the US dollar on the world stage, simply because if you seize a country's assets when it needs them, then nobody else will want to hold their own assets in that currency in case they get on the wrong side of the Americans in terms of foreign policy. So seizing assets is a crazy thing to do. As far as I know, in most wars throughout human history, financial flows have been allowed to circulate because the dominant financial player always knows that it's better to finance your enemy than for them to find financing elsewhere. And of course, this is exactly what we're seeing. I mean, the gold price is now up over $4,000 an ounce, and it seems to be only rising. Silver's just taken off as well.
Where will it go? Where will it go?
David Goldman thinks it'll go to $10,000 an ounce. He thinks that's the equilibrium price, especially if it starts to be used for the clearance of global trade. I don't know. I wouldn't make a firm call, but I mean, I don't see any evidence that it's continuing to go down, and it doesn't strike me as a bubble because the demand is fundamental demand. It's demand largely from central banks and private holders as well. But central banks are realizing that it's a lot better to sit on physical bullion right now, and so this is de facto some of the initial evidence, these massive central bank purchases of gold. Of the de-dollarization, or the beginning of de-dollarization of the world economy. We'll go into some of that more toward the end. So now we're in a position, this is from January 2024, that even the Atlantic Council is recognizing this process of de-dollarization. The Atlantic Council is effectively the think tank of the American government. It's quite closely aligned with the State Department. And so when the Atlantic Council recognizes something, it means that something is being officially recognized. And actually, we're now at the point where the collapse of US dollar hegemony has begun. So if we go back and we look at Putin's speech in March 2022 about some of these sanctions, he said that the illegitimate freezing of the currency reserves of the Bank of Russia marks the end of the reliability of so-called first-class assets. In fact, the US and the EU have defaulted on their obligations to Russia. Now everybody knows that financial reserves can simply be stolen, and many countries in the immediate future will begin, I am sure that this will happen, to convert their paper and digital assets into real reserves of raw materials, land, food, gold, and other real estate, which will only result in more shortages in these markets. Now, the impact hasn't been as bad on commodities markets as Putin thought, but if you bet on gold, you would have done pretty well. This chart's a little out of date, actually. As I said, it's gone up now by $4,000 over $4,000 an ounce. But the whole market's gone crazy, and as the headline there says, people are now realizing that there's a rush on the part of central banks to hoard as much gold as possible. The Russians themselves have been long gold for quite some time. Actually, it's very interesting that that their purchases of gold really start accelerating after the 2014 annexation of Crimea, after the Euromaidan revolution or coup or whatever you want to call it in Kiev, and they really accelerate the gold purchases, and then they basically stop around the time of the pandemic. I mean, I think we could tell now that the Russian government was probably beginning to plan the war at this period. So they effectively went very heavily long gold and then launched the war. You do wonder how much planning there was behind this, the transition that we're currently seeing. So really, these were kind of fundamental underlying drivers, but the financial markets didn't pay attention to the potential for de-dollarization for quite some time. And they were able to kind of float in thin air for a long time. But I think the real beginning of the collapse of many aspects of US dollar hegemony started with Liberation Day. This was the huge slew of tariffs that Trump announced in April of 2025. Now, many of them have been walked back, but it's continued to have its effect regardless. The Liberation Day tariffs have definitely led to some noticing on the part of people. People have begun to notice that something's going on with the dollar. So this is a kind of, this is from Project Syndicate, which is a very mainstream sort of the you could think of it as the common sense or the accepted wisdom of the economics profession, and they're beginning to recognize this. But one of the most interesting things was Stephen Moran, who I'm not sure his role at the moment, but he used to be the head of the chairman of economic advisors. He gave a speech, I think it was at Heritage, and because he's a White House official, effectively, his speech was put up on the White House website, and you see it here. And Stephen Moran said something that got an awful lot of attention in private. It didn't get as much attention in public. I think the US media were encouraged not to cover it, but everyone talks about this in private. And what he said was, trade deficits have decimated our manufacturing sector and many working class families and their communities to facilitate non-Americans trading with each other. Let me clarify that by reserve currency, I mean all the international functions of the dollar, private savings, and trade included. I've often used the example that when private agents in two separate foreign countries trade with each other, it's typically denominated in dollars because of America's status as the reserve provider. That trade entails savings housed in dollar securities, often treasuries. As a result of all this, Americans have been paying for peace and prosperity, not just for themselves, but for non-Americans too. Now, what this implies is that a senior White House official saw the reserve currency status of the dollar as being responsible, at least in part, for the deindustrialization of the United States. This is true. This is why the United States deindustrialized. The strong dollar policy is effectively why deindustrialization took place. After this speech came out, there was a lot of chatter. And Stephen Moran, I don't think he formally walked it back, but he didn't make many public appearances afterwards. And this signals that the administration, people in the administration who understands how the global monetary system work, know that the reserve currency status of the dollar is bad for America. It's good for Wall Street. It's good for the global liberal empire. It's bad for America. But they don't know what to do with this. And there's a lot of nervousness around making some sort of a transition. But markets are starting to notice. This is a scatter plot from January 2024 to May 2025, and on the left-hand side we have the dollar index. So this is how high or how low the dollar is, and on the bottom we have the 10-year TIPS yield. That's the Treasury Inflation Protected Security Yield. That's effectively an inflation-adjusted Treasury. It's a very good metric for real terms US borrowing. And what you see is, up until recently, if the dollar went up, the TIPS yield would go up. And if the dollar went down, the TIPS yield would go down. And what this meant was that if the dollar falls, it becomes cheaper for the United States government to borrow. This is really how the US dollar system works. That America, it's like America have a coin that they flip, and it's, as they say, heads, I win, tails, you lose. And that's how the American system worked. If the dollar fell, they'd get cheaper borrowing rates. Any other country, if their currency falls, or most other countries, they'll have higher borrowing rates. So if you start experiencing a fall in your currency, it starts to put a squeeze on your capacity to borrow. But the magic sauce of American global reserve hegemony was that when the dollar began to weaken, borrowing rates went down. And so it actually eased pressure.
Can that magic be explained? I mean, it sounds like magic.
It's flight to safety, as they call it in economic markets. Whenever there's volatility in the financial markets, the dollar starts to fall, and there's a flight to safety into US treasuries. That's precisely what it is.
Wow, got it.
But here we go. Look at this. This is after Liberation Day. Now what's happening is the US dollar's fallen, which it has fallen quite substantially since Liberation Day. And the TIPS yields have either stayed the same or they've gone up. The magic is gone. So what the United States is right now currently experiencing is, for the first time in history, its creditworthiness, its capacity to borrow, rests on its capacity to keep the ball in the air in the financial markets. And that leads me to think that the United States is one financial crisis away from the end of the cheap credit regime. This is being seen in America through a very narrow lens. I think the Fed is nervous about the borrowing issues, but Americans are mainly seeing it in pressures on their 60-40 portfolio, which of course is a portfolio with 60% equities and 40% bonds. And the idea is that when the equities go down, the bonds go up. But what we're seeing now is when the equities go down, the bonds go down as well. And so almost you could say that the 60-40 portfolio itself, in the United States at least, was a phenomenon of the global reserve currency era. So there is a possibility that we could transition from this in a more managed way. We had a conference in Budapest. You'll see Charles Yockey's there. He's currently working for the State Department, I believe. Professor James Galbraith is there, the son of J.K. Galbraith, and Gladden Pappan, who's the president of my institute. And we had a discussion about this paper that I put out, Reimagining Bretton Woods, and how we could restructure the global currency order. You'd only really need two countries to do this, the United States and China.
Right.
I've spoken to Chinese, not at a governmental level, but at a think tank level, and I think that there's some appetite for this. Will the United States have any appetite for this? I don't know. But the point is, the United States, the era of cheap borrowing is one financial cycle away from being over. In fact, I would say it's already over. I looked this morning at the 30-year Treasury, and there's been a vast decline in the overnight Fed funds rate because the Federal Reserve has been easing very aggressively, and Trump has been pushing them very hard. It's not impacting the 30-year yield. It's not impacting borrowing rates properly. It is a little bit, but it's not impacting them in the way that we typically would have seen. So I would advise that America manage this transition by recreating a more multilateral version of the Bretton Woods system, basically the original Keynes Bancor plan, but we'll see. There's a lot of chaos in the world. I suspect that the end of this will go out with a bang, and it'll probably be the popping of the AI bubble and the potential unwinding of the private equity mess. So what comes next in the world after the collapse of global liberalism? Well, right now, if you point these things out, you'd get called names. That's the West has become so confused, I'd say, very weakened, that it's become incredibly paranoid. And anyone who points out that there are huge global changes will be said, you're pro-China if you point out that China's the biggest economy in the world, which is just a fact. You're pro-Russia if you say that the sanctions haven't worked. This is getting to the point now where the propaganda is becoming ridiculous, and it's impairing our capacity to govern ourselves effectively. It's very dangerous, actually. So I think looking at this from the perspective of people who would broadly consider themselves post-liberals, I would certainly, or anyone who's not wedded to the liberal regime in its current form, I think what we should be doing is just embracing the reality of the situation. As I said, the liberals are now in a position where they're just denying basic reality. They don't have a coherent story to tell about the world at the moment. You're starting to see cracks around the edges, and Emmanuel Macron coming out and briefly talking about multipolarity, and then people will push back on him very hard and so on. So their narrative will crack because it's just so out of step with reality. So I think that people who don't like the current system should just stick to reality and be the best analysts of that possible. I think post-liberals and, you could say dissidents in general have several...
So does it have some parallels to the late Soviet Union in some ways?
I think that's the exact parallel. I think that's exactly it. In the 80s, the dissidents in the Soviet Union were just able to point out reality, and the party officials had to say, well, there is no shortage, comrade. Are you not being patriotic if you don't notice reality? And when a regime gets itself into that position, it's extremely vulnerable. It's probably on the brink of collapse. I think post-liberals have several inbuilt advantages in the New World Order. They're generally pretty alienated by their own liberal ruling elite, and so they're able to see reality more clearly, even if, some philosophers and so on don't understand the full ramifications of the changes. They tend to be grounded in natural law thinking, so they can embrace kind of prudential judgment, sensible common sense judgment, while the liberals have a real tendency to retreat into ideology, very similar to the Soviets again. And I think this is really important. The new emerging global power elite are pretty normal culturally. Most cultures share very broad norms about, families, about basic morality and so on. Like, these don't tend to diverge greatly in countries with fairly high rates of civilization. So obviously the Incas would engage in mass child sacrifice. I think this will be a not very civilized society in effect. But once a society reaches a fairly civilized state, I think that they converge on more than they disagree with. And I think the post-liberals in the West actually have more in common with the illiberal or non-liberal cultures and civilizations that are beginning to emerge. So civilizational politics in general seems to be what's on the rise. It seems that, as I alluded to at the beginning of the lecture, if we might be retreating to a pre-1914 sort of world. And what that actually means, if you look at a map before the First World War, is very old civilizational powers were there. So you might think the most famous one after the First World War that collapsed was the Ottoman Empire. This huge empire that controlled but most of the Middle East, and which had been there for a very, very long time, and it played an integral part in European history and so on. But even beyond that, after the First World War, Russia, for example, turned into the Soviet Union, and so it ceased to be, in a normal sense, a Russian civilizational power. Well, what we're seeing now is civilizational politics is returning. In Russia, this is very obvious. There's a heavy emphasis on re-embracing the Orthodox Christian aspect. And some people say, well, just because the state is backing the church or the church is backing the state doesn't mean that more people are going to Orthodox Mass. I think that's debatable. I think the elite is starting to go to these Orthodox ceremonies, and often things flow down from the top. But even if it was just a question of aesthetics, the way that a society presents its state and its culture to itself is very important, even if people are quite cynical about the church at a bottom level. In China, we're seeing this as well. The discussion in China at the moment is growing. Is basically that Marxism has produced a great deal of change in China, and it's created the current Communist Party structure, certainly. But Marxism doesn't really give you a vision with which to rule society. And what the Chinese are beginning to find out is that they have a very old civilization. In fact, it's the oldest on the planet, and it is a very high-level civilization. And so they're beginning to revert back to Confucian norms. Now, as I showed in the lecture, the Confucian norms never went away. Even during the 1980s period, when the Communist Party were very set on being communist, they were talking about these Confucian ideals of a moderately prosperous society. But today, there's active discussion about this in China, and the idea that that the party would lean on this or anything is nonsense. I've been to China twice now this year, and people are talking about this absolutely openly, and the Communist Party officials are interested. They haven't really, they're hedging their bets at the moment, but there's some language being put into some of the Xi Jinping speeches at the moment, which is clearly signaling this direction. And there's a very strong movement in China right now to re-embrace what they call fine Chinese culture. And you see, so a lot of cultural shows, a lot of embrace of the old costumes. I went to Beijing, saw people taking pictures in the park dressed up in the old costumes and everything. And in the Middle East too. This is a headline from January 2024. This is Erdogan's son said that converting the Hagia Sophia mosque, converting the Hagia Sophia back into a mosque was the first step towards the freedom for Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa Mosque. Obviously, that's in Israel. Now, that's the son of Erdogan. I'm not saying that they're serious and they actually are going to, liberate, quote unquote, Jerusalem and Al-Aqsa Mosque, but that's the direction that the rhetoric is tending toward. So I do wonder if we have a bit of a phrase in Budapest among some of us that old maps might soon become new maps, that the older maps of Europe, of the Middle East, of these places that were massively impacted by the emergence of the global liberal empire, I'd say after the First World War, but after the First and Second World War, really, they might just revert, because some of these power blocks have a natural basis to them. I'll just give the example of Hungary, where I'm living, Central Europe. It's former Austro-Hungarian monarchy. The countries of the former Austro-Hungarian monarchy are beginning to realize that having some sort of an economic, not bloc maybe because most of them are in the EU, but having stronger economic ties just makes sense. I mean, a lot of these formations that we saw, like the Austro-Hungarian monarchy, were not created artificially. They kind of grew up over time. And so I wonder if some of this won't make a comeback. I suppose the question is, how far will this go? It's a little bit of a joke that the Papal States and the deunification of Italy, I don't think it'll go that far. I just want to emphasize just how different maps looked as recently as the 19th century. Will the Papal States make a comeback? I don't know. We have an American Pope. Maybe they'd be interested in having some sort of a Papal State in Europe. But the reason that I mention this is because I think it's worth having a lot of imagination about what could happen in the future. We really, really don't know. I'm fairly confident that a lot of the artificial boundaries that were drawn after the First and Second World War will probably be eroded over time. Maybe not even in my lifetime, but over the next 100 years. But really, we don't know what'll happen. We don't know what'll come out of this. So the big question moving forward really is, can we learn to live in harmony, tolerate the existence of other civilizations while cultivating our own? And my co-author David Dusenbury and I have just put out this essay, which has been quite successful in American affairs, called The Era of Recivilization. And what we're saying is the West needs to, if the West wants good leadership, it has to put all this global conflict away. It's not going to win. It's losing, actually. But it needs to put all that away and focus on the destruction that the liberal project has caused domestically to the West. And it needs to kind of re-civilize itself, as we say in the essay. And in this, it will be joining the emergent global trends. So it'll be a kind of a natural process. And maybe the way we put it in the paper is that if the West is almost on the verge of dropping out of history in a sort of a Hegelian sense, it really risks dropping out of history, like, for example, North Korea did when it became an isolated... Spain. Exactly. That's what it risks, a former great empire just not being relevant anymore. And maybe the way to enter back into history is through a mutual process of re-civilization and recognizing that there's nothing wrong with having a Chinese civilization and a Russian civilization, and maybe even a Neo-Ottoman civilization, as long as we learn to live with one another and so on. Maybe this isn't a huge problem, and something maybe even to aspire to. But no matter what happens, I am fairly confident at this stage that liberalism has run its course. And at least on a global basis, they may try and maintain liberal ideology shut in a sort of a hermit kingdom in the West. That's a possibility, although unlikely. But it's not spreading. The Francis Fukuyama argument that liberalism would spread all over the world, that's gone. And it looks to me like that system that began to spring up in the Chink ports in 11th century England, the piracy system that global liberalism ultimately emerged out of, it's probably gone. That's probably finished now. So no matter what happens next, as I say, the pirate is dead. So thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Philipp.